And we are back. It's the Rhetoric Warriors podcast. Once again, we are updating you on the news flashes from the world of rhetoric. It's not just 2,500 years old. It's still going on, man. It's still out there. So we're grabbing the rhetoric news and bringing it to the table. I am Dr. Dan, PhD in rhetoric, late night comedy writer, rhetorician, comedian, rhetoromedian. I founder of Rhetoric Warriors. The whole purpose is to get people some more sophisticated skills for dealing with a complicated world in persuasion. I think we need it. On the podcast, I talk to comedians about their politics. Lately, I've been letting them on doing uncensoring the comedians and letting them do bits that they can't do in clubs anymore because people are just so sensitive. I also talk to conservatives a lot because the right interests me. And it's outside my world, and so I'm fascinated by it. I do little conversions here and there. I chat with people who have causes, who are trying to get that stuff into the world, and check out how they're doing that. And I talk to persuasion pros and more rhetoricians on this podcast than any other podcast you're going to hear today. I'll stand by that claim. Today's another episode of Persuasion Pros. This is my buddy Mike Long's third visit, which means it's time to dive into some expertise, get some micro gritty stuff in there. Mike's a playwright.
Any longer.
He's a story guy. He's a speech writer, and he has a course coming up that he's going to be teaching. He's going to talk about a little bit today. And we're going to focus on villains. Like, what is the use of the villain these days? How do you construct one? Why are they so super valuable in rhetoric and in story? Mike, are you ready to dig into the villains?
I am ready for episode 3 of the Mike Long trilogy. This is awesome. We're gonna have a whole flipping encyclopedia along the wall of Dan and Mike, just going for it.
Yeah, man. So you're sitting there in Georgetown again, right? Are you living in Georgetown, or you just teach at Georgetown?
No, I teach at Georgetown. I live out here in the Northern Virginia suburbs.
Okay. I'm asking everybody where they live because I'm tired of living in Austin and my lease is about up. So I'm looking around. Where do I want to move?
No, you don't want it. You don't want none of this, Dewey Cox. You don't want none of this. This is it's for what you pay versus what you get. Northern Virginia is crazy. We're talking, San Francisco style money around here.
It's insane, man. It's like I would move back to Los Angeles because I got tons of friends there, but it's the same thing. I'm probably not going to work in TV. And why go pay those prices if I don't need to be right there? I like it. I like the beach and everything else, but man, come on, America, get cheap.
I saw a thing. I don't know what I was looking for. I have a lot of ties to Western Kentucky, and I saw a house for sale on the lake in Western Kentucky that cost maybe $10,000 more than the outstanding balance on my mortgage, which is almost paid. I was like, you're kidding. I could fit 3 of my houses in the lake house, next to the lake, and have money left over to buy dinner. And so, yeah, you don't want to live here. This is crazy.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm balancing, right? It's like, do I move back to Kentucky, like to a lake where it's cheap, where it's a cool place to live, like internet. I'm doing, I don't know, 80% of my life's on the internet anyway. All I have to do is be able to go out and walk around a lake. That sounds like another 20%.
Yeah, do that. And next time I'm in Paducah or around there, you move to the lake. We'll come there and we'll hang out on a boat and we'll record a podcast from the sailboat. It'll be awesome.
All right, man. Well, let's get into this constructing villains. I've got a way of kind of wandering through this, but go anywhere you want. I like I said, I get very interested in these sub-concepts of rhetoric. And there's the normal world, there's the real world of villains right now. And like what we're talking about, just like inflation. And suddenly everything like homes and houses costing so much.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds evil. It sounds like there's a villain in there somewhere. Like the villain in the housing market, the ones I've heard suggested are corporations, these conglomerations of people who are buying up the houses, crushing up the prices, and basically bankrupting the middle class in that process.
Mm-hmm.
Like they looked out and they're like, well, where's the middle class's wealth? Oh, look at that. It's in their homes. Let's go and buy the homes, jack up the prices. I bet you we can get all their money. So that's a potential villain, right?
It is. I think there are a couple of thoughts just to jump right in. You can talk about it from the economic standpoint, and then you can talk about it from the storytelling standpoint. From the economic standpoint, it's almost a straw man because middle class wealth held in unliquidatable assets might as well not be wealth. Like I was talking to, I'll be discreet. I was talking to somebody the other day, and she said, "Well, I have $1 million," and I said, "Really, write me a check for 100,000. You can't do it because that's not what it means to be a millionaire at this particular age." So if you're a homeowner and your home cashes out at, let's say, $1 million, let's be generous. You got $1 million home, which would buy you a 1-bedroom here in Northern Virginia. You and I both know that's worthless. You can borrow against it, but that's not liquid.
You mean like if you sold it, you couldn't move laterally in the same area and it wouldn't get you anything. But you could do like what everybody's doing in California and New York, right? They're selling their houses there and they move them to Austin, and
right,
they're jacking up the prices here.
And that's fine. But you're talking about you're not talking when we talk about wealth. It's one thing to have liquid wealth. It's something else to have assets that can't be touched. If you own the Mona Lisa, good for you. But you can either be rich or you can own the Mona Lisa and eat crackers. You can't have both.
So we have these invisible villains, these kind of unidentifiable, ambiguous villains, but that's not what works in stories. Stories, exactly. You need a concrete villain.
That's where I was headed. Yes.
Like even in The Big Short, right? I mean, they were going after, I think, banks essentially, and these kind of crazy loans that were available during that time, these bundled loans. And even though there wasn't a specific villain, like I don't remember a person, but I do remember a practice, like an industry practice in banking, bundling loans and then reselling them as derivatives or whatever they were called, became the villain in that thing, I think.
The Big Short is such a well-told story, and there's so many things I want to say here, and I want to keep it interesting for people who are listening. So I'll say in The Big Short, I agree. It's more of an idea that's evil, and so the focus is really not on the villain, but on villainy, on a bad thing, which typically in a story needs to have a face, a literal face.
Right. It needs some personification of that idea.
And I think what makes The Big Short so special is that it manages to keep us engaged sympathetically with the victims without ever putting a face on the villain. And I can't name another story that does that, let alone, it does it well. I can't even name one that does it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think because we saw so I created this little 3, triangle, like you can't have a villain without victims, right?
Right.
And you can't have a villain without a hero. And that's the 3-part structure. Got to have victims, got to have a hero, to get a villain. And in The Big Short, we saw the victimage, like the 2008 collapse, the economy almost going into Great Depression again. We didn't really get victimized by it. Some people lost a little bit, but we came, and dug into our savings and magically fixed it. But the evil, there was no hero. I don't remember any hero. Barack Obama was president, and he kind of, shepherded some of that together, but he was never held up really as the hero that fixed the economic collapse. But there was that villainy of these vague bankers, these greedy people, which is an American villain, right? Overly greedy people.
I think that just from how far we are already, that a discussion of villains is probably not the place. Probably The Big Short is not the place to go to talk about villains as villains.
It's a special case.
It's a special case. There's the Steve Carell character who wants so desperately to be the hero in the picture. He arises there. I think the excitement of The Big Short arises from the pleasure of understanding something that seemed impenetrable. And I believe that's an interesting and unique case of storytelling. It is in part the engine of stand-up comedy. Let me tell you, mind if I tell you a little story?
Tell us, do it, man. That's all about you, buddy. You roll.
Well, God forbid it should be all about me, because
It's all about us.
everybody just turn it off. But
Whatever.
When I teach speech writing, I talk about the need for carrying people through with an arc. Obviously, that we have to have the setup, and we have to have the explanation. We have to have the resolution at the end. And I'm committed to this in great detail about how this works. But then a few years ago, I'm sitting here thinking, well, this is how we hold their attention. And yet I look at stand-up, which I love so dearly, and stand-up doesn't follow that method at all. And I thought, what have I done? I've ignored the very best way to do it, and yet I'm teaching this other thing. And after I thought about it for several weeks, I was genuinely bothered by this. I realized that stand-up was not about the arc of a villain or a hero or anything else. Stand-up is about what I like to call the ooh, piece of candy method from Family Guy. Ooh, piece of candy. Remember, he's luring James Woods down the street. Ooh, piece of candy. Ooh, piece of candy. And I think, to come back to The Big Short, that's what The Big Short is. It's like, ooh, I understand more. Ooh, I understand more. Ooh, I understand more. And then as you go, Jay Roach, who I guess wrote and directed it, said, why don't we make these things interesting visually and orally as we proceed? We'll break a lot of rules, and this way we carry them through, not only with understanding, but also with amusement. So villainy is an element of the story, but a villain qua villain doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you talk about stand-up versus storytelling, stand-up is the art of stimulation. To me, that's all it is.
Write that shit down, Dan. There you go. That's the line.
It's what can you do to keep me riveted? Whatever trick you need, whatever little micro technique you need, like to keep me in there. And I think The Big Short did that. There's clearly a hero, like an intellectual hero in The Big Short, the guy who was explaining this the whole time. So you could kind of follow him, and like he was taking you through some very esoteric financial theory in a fairly simple way. But again, that sense of impending villainy. So let's go off The Big Short and see if we can hit something a little more, clear with people. And you can pick whatever you want, but I've been rewatching Breaking Bad again because I can just wander through great stories over and over. And to me, the villainy inside of Breaking Bad is so good because it's always right around him. Like one of the keys to making a villain really potent is not have them off in the distance. They kind of do this with Game of Thrones, right? Winter is coming. But then they would also go and take you to winter, like when they're at the wall. So you got to experience it over and over again. But in Breaking Bad, every villain is right there in his world. His wife becomes a villain. His kid, Hank catching him, all these people become threats to him. And even though he's the central villain hero, like there's so much villainy in his world around him under threat, and it never moves away. It's a few feet away everywhere. And so that kind of villainy around you really amplifies the experience for the audience of, oh my God, he's going to get caught.
Yeah. Well, I think the place to begin, and at first I'll say that Breaking Bad is an obsession with me, and I'll even turn my camera here so you can see. There's my little shrine to Breaking Bad all up and down that wall right there. You're looking at Bryan Cranston's sign that he parked in front of. I own that sign, and autographs and signs and pictures of me with Cranston and other people. So I am obsessed with Breaking Bad. Having established that, I think I think you have to ask, what do you mean by a villain? And in its simplest form, the answer, I think, in a dramatic sense, is someone who seeks to impose some kind of damage, whether that's moral damage or physical damage or disorder. And once you have that nut, you're better positioned to talk about what it is. And why Walter White is a villain is fairly obvious. He's going to break the law. But
nobody cares about that law. Nobody cares about that.
Nobody cares about that. So why do we care about Walter White? I think that Walter White is so compelling because he is compelling to a certain demographic. I as a middle-aged man, when I saw Breaking Bad, and here was a guy who was entering his 50s, and he goes, "Look what I have done with my life. It's not what I expected. It's not nothing, but it is not what I expected." And this is how every man and woman, I suppose, too. I think of men just because I'm a man, but men and women who have been especially responsible their whole lives turn this corner and they go, what did it mean? Did I ever do anything for me? And then he's faced with the time, the TikTok, which is another factor in stories, of course, a key factor to them. And he says, you know what? I'm going to do this though the heavens fall. And so now you have a villain who is immediately identifiable with the viewer, and you've created this splendid conflict with the audience. Never mind who his opponent is, never mind who his assistants are. You have a villain that you are rooting for. And this was the problem that Gilligan talked about so often, is he said, I gave up after a while trying to make you hate him. And I don't think Vince Gilligan completely, I mean this with all respect. I've met him, I've talked to him. But he didn't understand what he had done. And he said, I tried to make him worse and worse to make people hate him. And I couldn't do it. I finally stopped because they identified, we as audience members, especially middle-aged men, identified with this guy at a core sense as he's seeking meaning.
Yeah. And he's Bryan Cranston, who had just done Malcolm in the Middle. I mean, perfect casting. Yeah. Like, yeah, there's no way to make him evil. I don't care what you do. Even when he was like playing his most evil lines about I am the one who knocks, I'm like, I'm not scared of this guy. You know, to me, like, so if you look back in the,
have you ever worked with him or written for him, by the way? Have you spent time with Cranston?
No, I've never met that guy. He got really popular with Breaking Bad after I was in, the talk show business. He was too big to actually come on the second shows where I wrote, the Late Late Show. So, like, if you look at
funny thing about it, I met him twice, and the first time we had a nice conversation, very brief, and then I met him again. And I was in New York, and I mentioned that we had met, and he goes, "You're the Georgetown guy. I remember you. I was in heaven that Cranston remembered me." But anyway, that's yeah. Please,
he seems like a regular dude.
When I've talked to him, he's been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, that's the healthiest way to go through Hollywood. But so you look at the villains he had to deal with, like the clear cut villains. So you start with Tuco, right? That was his first real villain, crazed meth dealer. And then he went from Tuco and he started having to fight with the cartel, and then Gus, and then the guy in the wheelchair, whatever that guy's name was. Hector. And then, up into the higher levels of the cartel and, these kind of things. So,
and then the white supremacists at the end, the Nazis.
And the white supremacists at the end, which I thought was actually a story deficit. It was a liability because they were not as intimidating as Gus. They were not as good a villain as Gus. They were too predictable. I got it. Gus was awesome. That has to be one of the best TV villains ever, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Take Gus apart for me. What do you see in Gus that made him such a strong villain?
Gus is this guy, Hannibal Lecter. Gus is that. Hannibal Lecter was frightening because he appeared to know everything, and he never, ever displayed it except to do damage with it. And Gus Fring was the same thing. This is the strength, I think, to jump topics in a big way here. This is an acting trick to just hold back. If you can be dead still and let people assume what they want to project it upon them, then that's the key to Gus Fring. And Giancarlo Esposito, who played the role, of course, has talked about it as a practitioner of yoga. He said, I just go to that place. Because he's not like that in person.
Right.
At all.
Well, emotionlessness, that completely unreadable, no emotion, is an evil. That's a villain factor. Like, we don't trust people who are like that typically, unless like they're in a guru status and, they've already been bathed in goodness. These guys have already been bathed in badness. A lot of people have already established that they're horrible. Like with Lecter, they do a preamble about him, when they're taking Starling in there, and the scumbag, prison warden was like, yeah, so here's a picture of him eating somebody's face, and his heart rate never got over 65. Well, they've narrativized him as the worst human being on the planet. And then when he's completely placid, yeah, it's just this crazy doubling of that effect.
Yeah.
And Gus is the same way. You're exactly right.
Gus is one more thought about Lecter is that and as much as I admire Thomas Harris, the author, who is very, very sparse in his output, I thought he made a mistake. Boy, I hesitate to say that. I thought he made a mistake when he wrote the subsequent Hannibal books that went into Hannibal's past. Hannibal Lecter, who even has a line in one of the pictures, maybe in one of the books, where he said, I just was this way. There's no explanation for me. Harris proceeded to produce an explanation for him that was rooted in trouble as a young man, a young bright man in Europe. And it ripped down a lot of the horror of having this appear from nothing. I thought that was a terrible mistake. And I think that's why we'll never have a show that goes deeply into Gus's backstory, for the same reason. I think Gilligan is a better storyteller than that.
Well, I think when, you watch Better Call Saul and you got to see, different aspects of Gus. And even in Breaking Bad, when you showed Gus was getting revenge for, his lover being killed by the cartel. And you saw that play out in Better Call Saul as well, where he got his revenge on Hector and these kind of things. But it is that sense of, if you're going to amplify villainy, which is your job as the storyteller, it's your job as a storyteller, it's your job as a politician, which is storytelling. You need a supervillain, and you need that person to be so visceral, so hateable, so disgusting or impulsive that it triggers everybody when they see that person. And I always thought, like, lover or hater, Hillary Clinton, absorbed more attack from more people over 30, 40 years, maybe than any other human being.
Yeah, she was always right in the crosshairs, that's for sure.
And she it just got sponged, and it bothered me that she ran for president as hard as she did. I think she probably lost to Trump because she was just such a corrupted public figure. She had been stained too much. Again, whether it's true or not makes no difference. She was at the point where she was so libeled and so villainized that one mistake, like with emails, looked so dark and sinister, and she couldn't beat it, Yeah. Versus like her husband, Bill, who had been accused of tons and tons of stuff and just kept grinning and smiling, and just, it basically rolled off, except for the, sexual harassment or whatever of Lewinsky. So it's interesting watching that kind of visceral intensity being done to a villain like Gus or Lecter. And I think you're exactly right. The more mystery you leave in there, where it seems like organic, uncaused evil, the more intense they are.
Yeah, there's a little bit that they allude to in both the series about Gus having a background with Pinochet, and it's just mentioned in passing a couple times, but that's it, and that's as much as we know, which makes him scarier, I think, because it's not an explanation, it's not an excuse, it's just like, oh, he's always been this way.
Yeah, that kind of, somehow he may have been in the death squads. He may have been an assassin.
I know there are people who know more about Breaking Bad than me, which is saying a hell of a lot, by the way. and I think that there's a specific reference to his role, but I believe he was a general for Pinochet. But there's somebody who's watching this now going, no, you idiot, here's what he was.
Well, yeah, and for Americans have no idea what all that is. I mean, that's become past history. That even when it was going on, it was one of those secondary stories that nobody really tracked. I remember watching Death and the Maiden, and the intensity of that, like her intensity towards him as a villain, and just how victimized she had been, and how we lived through that with her, the trauma that she had gone through. And so, but it was still like, oh, I know kinda there's some shit that happened down there, but I don't really know what happened.
I have a villain for you, if I may jump to another
villain
do it. For a moment. And I'm a little embarrassed that I can't. I think it is called This Is How It Goes. I may be wrong. It's a play by Neil LaBute, who is one of my top 2 or 3 artistic heroes, and another person I've gotten to spend a little bit of time with. And this is the picture with Paul Rudd. And Paul Rudd is a middling, sort of barely successful guy who falls in love with a graduate student in art, and she begins to bring him along, and changes the way he dresses, and changes the way he talks, and changes his very Pygmalion kind of thing, until she even talks him into having surgery to change his physical appearance. And we get to the end of the picture, and he stumbles across a sign on campus that is the display for his girlfriend's senior project. It was him the whole time. And I remember seeing this in the theater, And it's the only time in my life I've shouted at a movie screen.
Ah.
I was so angry at that. And that kind of villainy that you don't see very often, which is you don't know you've been hanging around a villain until the villain just opens a coat, and here we are. That's the most effective moment of villain emotion I can name.
Yeah, that's a super intense package for sure. Like that release of that much hate in that moment,
Oh yeah,
being
because you liked her.
betrayed and
You liked her. It's absolute betrayal, and that's something which is a little far afield from Gus. But when I think about what makes me feel something as a villain, that stored up surprise. Because I thought, who's the bad guy here? And we're 5 minutes from the end, and there it is, and you find out.
So who are your villains? Talk about some of your plays, like pull up a couple of villains that you've created that you like to throw out at the world, and we'll take those apart a little bit.
The most popular play that I've written is called Color Timer. And it's about you're in television, so you probably know that a color timer is the person who adjusts the color after in post production. And it used to be done in an acid bath, or in a chemical bath rather, and now it's done electronically. And I wrote a play about a woman who shows up to a date, doing this. I'm an old man. It's a computer date. Shows up to a Tinder date of some kind. And she, halfway through the meal, 5 minutes into the meal, she says, I have a gun under this table. You can look and see, and I'm going to kill you. You have 30 minutes to talk me out of it.
I like it.
And this won the LaBute Festival a couple of years ago, and it's been produced a lot. And I liked her so much because she was utterly likable and utterly confident and utterly arrogant about it. And just to top it off with some dissonance, I wrote her using the style of speaking of the McGill character, the James Everett McGill character in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So she has this overly mannered, old-fashioned way of speaking. And there's a line, the only line in my whole career that's ever been quoted back to me over and over is this one. What are you talking about? The aluminum can is the bang shang-a-lang of the whole soft drink experience. And that's her line. And she talks like that through the whole thing. And she sees right through him. And this character is such a wonderful villain because you just can't get a head of steam up to hate her. You know that she's crazy and mean, and she's doing this for her own reasons, which have nothing to do except her own emotional thrill. And here's someone who exists to be mean because it is fun. And I think those are the worst kinds of villains, the best kind of villains to create. There's nothing in it, like the end of the Eddie Murphy picture, where they've bet that they could make a bad man or good man bad or something, and they were betting $1 through the whole thing. You remember how that concludes? Those are my favorite kinds of villains to write, and she is played by the great Colleen Backer in St. Louis at the theater there, St. Louis Actors Studio. So
you gave her a villainy. Did you give reasons? Did you explain why? Like, did she have a motivational understructure?
Yeah, in the text, the whole thing begins with this discussion about emotion and what they like to do. And she says, you never know who you are until you're in a crisis. And in that moment, you feel exactly who you are because there's no time to think through. Who you are comes out. And that's why she says she's doing this to him. Now there's no way out. I'm going to find out who you are right now.
It's funny. It reminds me of, do you want to hear a real life semi-villain from my online dating experience?
I love it. Yes, please do.
So she never transcended into villain, but she clearly had the potential. So I met this person online. We talked a little bit and decided to meet. And we're meeting at like 7 at an outside bar. And I'm walking up a little bit before 7. And I see her sitting there. And she's already got 2 empties and starting on her 3rd pint in front of her. And so I sat down. I'm like, so how long have you been here? She's like, like 20 minutes. I'm like, you're three in. That's pretty impressive. But she had tattoos everywhere, and that's fine. It's Austin. I'm used to that. But she had one tattoo around her neck that was a necklace. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, why do you have a necklace tattooed around your neck? And she's like, well, the last guy that I lived with or dated really for a while, he when he left, he stole a bunch of shit from me, and he stole my favorite necklace. and I'm going to make sure nobody ever steals that necklace ever again. So she had it tattooed. And then she proceeded to tell me a bunch of horrible shit from her life. And she had been in the military and all this stuff. And all these I mean, I was getting hit in the face with more red flags than I've ever seen. I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to go. Like 15, 20 minutes in. She's like, well, don't you want to maybe do something? I'm like, nah, I forgot I got this thing. I got to go. This isn't. And I'm like, wow, there's trouble written all over this human. But how do you do that, man? That's worse than like Tyson's face tattoo to me. It's
Man, that's nuts. That's nuts. I think an interesting question is what do you do with a villain at the end of a story? Because sometimes, well, most of the time, of course, the villain loses. The villain is defeated. But there are other times when the villain is won over. I mean, we can talk about cases where the villain wins, but that's a different story. But
Americans don't like that story, man. They do not like the villain wins story.
My favorite example of this, and when I'm teaching storytelling, I use this a lot. I only saw them do it once, and you'll understand it immediately. Penn and Teller appear at a pier with a small audience. They have a box that's as tall as a man. They invite the audience to inspect the box. They pick a member of the audience from that little group, put him in the box, nail it shut, and the group as one pushes the box into the water. All right? That's the end. That's the end. And I think that there's so much to learn about the need for resolving things. And that was the whole point of the piece, is now that's the cruelest thing they could have done, is to deny that resolution. And we are so accustomed to resolution that we naturally go there without thinking about, unless you're a purposeful storyteller, thinking about why you delay the ending, why you have to think so hard about how you're going to get to the resolution. It can't just be, ooh, piece of candy. You can't just take them there until it naturally resolves itself. You have to reveal these things in such a way that the resolution truly brings relief. That's the whole heart of story, is tension and release. And whether we're talking about some outcome for the villain or outcome for the hero or something else, in the end, that resolution has to be there.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. Like in marketing, I move between worlds: entertainment, story, stand-up, education, and marketing. I have a marketing agency here, and so I import things over to clients sometimes and try to explain to them that you have to put, even in a commercial or a small ad or your social, you have to put an intense emotional experience in there. And that typically means you have to amplify pain and dissonance, ugliness, horrific, being gripped by something. And then you have to save people. You have to release it. And that experience, getting out of prison, getting out of the grips of a horrible whatever it is in life, is one of the most intense experiences that human beings can have. And so having the guts to intensify the pain so that you can intensify the release, that's hard. And I see people struggle with it in stories all the time. When I taught screenwriting, I was like, I need to hate your villain more. Like, I don't hate this villain. I'm not tortured by this villain. Yeah. And they're like, but, I'm like, no, it's just not intense enough to keep me in that emotional space. And that little flip, when the latch to your cell opens and you're like, shit, I get to leave. There's no, it's one of the strongest things there is.
Yeah. I think pro wrestling is the best at that kind of stuff. Don't you? I mean, I'm not a fan, but I understand how it works, and I admire that commercialization of the storytelling nut right there.
Yeah, all that super theatricality, again, in narrativity, you're trying to amp. Theatricals, you're trying to visualize, make it bigger and bigger. So, things like pro wrestling, now they've got guys dropping from the ceiling and shit like that, because once you've seen it, the villainy starts to shrink and you've got to up the villain all the time. I watched this a lot in American storytelling and action films. Like, you have to, like, they went through an impaling stage that was satisfying. They went through a beheading stage of the villain, like in Speed. Like, he, finally, like, Dennis Hopper raises his head and woof, gets his head taken off. So you have to kill the villain in a super satisfying way. And if it has to match the amount of hate and ugliness that person has generated. And that's part of the genius, I think, of American storytelling is we're willing to give you that.
Yeah.
Like we will kill a villain, man.
Yes. Now, are you familiar? I imagine you are, but with Monroe's motivated sequence, is that a familiar term to you?
Yeah. What is that? I don't remember that, but I know I've heard it.
It's a technique. It's not a very old technique, or at least the documentation isn't very old, maybe the 40s or so. I'm sure the idea goes back to Plato, Cicero. It's a 5-part way to present any solution. And it begins with attention. First, you get their attention. It's used in speech writing a lot, especially political speech writing. Then you present the problem. Then you identify the solution. Then you visualize what the world will be like with that solution. And then you offer the appeal. Please come and get it. And if you watch late night TV ads, you can see how this plays out. And you think the first one that comes to your mind shows someone tired of being cold. Your car has a scratch. Oh no, it's always boom, let's get your attention and then let's show how bad the problem is. And then they name it. And the reason this is of note for many, many reasons, but for our purposes, is that they spend no time trying to justify or convince you that their solution is correct.
Right.
They just offer it wrapped in a blanket of you felt bad, now you feel good. Don't you want some? They could say, and the answer is to wave your arms. Yes, waving your arms, and look how good these people feel when they wave their arms. There's no explanation, and it's an anti-intellectual approach that we're surrounded with constantly, and I think feeds this desire to just say, well, hell, that's what I want. Let's do it, as opposed to saying, does this really work?
Yeah, and I think that psychological training, that you get from a capitalist consumptive culture that relies on advertising and, that kind of messaging that you grew up with, you get a psychological foundation, a bedrock of understanding of what that sequence is. And I think it flows over into politics. It flows over into our storytelling. It flows over into everything. But it's the same thing over and over again that human beings, like I've seen this, the difference between American storytelling and European storytelling. Europeans will take you into pain and then just leave you there. Like they like to, do tragedies. So you're pulling somebody, and then they lose. You're like, damn it. If you're an American, that is not satisfying. Like you want the American story is somebody's in pain, but they deserve better and they keep at it and they deserve it and they end up getting it or something better. And when you play with villainy like that, like 99% of the story should have the villain in it. Really good storytelling. There's multiple villains, first of all, in every great story, but ultimately there's one just there all the time. Like you can't get away from it. It's just his presence over and over again. And you look in Marvel storytelling and superheroes because it's easier to find. Sometimes they draw with much bigger strokes, broader strokes. But like, with the Avengers series, and you have, they keep upping the ultimate villain. And then Thanos is sitting in a chair hovering behind all of them. And they haven't even got the Red Skull out yet. But I remember all these characters from comic books, and they're all invulnerable. They have no weaknesses. There's no way to beat them. They never show any of their weaknesses until the very end. Oh, look, turns out they have a weakness.
Yeah. Oh, he's spraying with water. Who knew?
Yeah, it's like the Wicked Witch, exactly. So you have to make them super invulnerable so that you don't see a way to win, and they don't give you a way to win. And then it's a cheat. It's a story cheat that turns out there's a flaw. We just never told you about it.
I'm not going to be as hard on that as you are. And although maybe I'm misreading you, but I mean, we talked about the mechanism, we've talked about the outcome, but we haven't talked about the why. And the why is catharsis. And that's the whole point of the relief is not to fulfill some commercial or capitalistic need. It is the human desire for catharsis, and that cuts across economic systems and cultures and everything else. In the end, we want to be strung along and then relieved in the end.
Do we? Or are we just trained to it? Like we definitely want relief. Like you can lay out, like if we took both of our lives right now and laid out all the problem areas,
right?
Like, okay, here's the problems I'm dealing with. I would love this piece of relief right here.
Yes, yes, yes. But we're talking about story. And in story, that's what we want. We know it's a safe place because we are given the promise of relief in the end. And so we go through. I mean, this is the psychological idea of catharsis in drama. That's why we appreciate drama, because it gives us a safe place to experience the thing that frightens us, the thing that gives us stress. And here we are experiencing stress, and then boom. And that's why one of the reasons I think these superhero movies are so popular is because at that level, whatever cultural icons you are, cultural touchstones you toss into it, you ultimately get the relief you crave from a seemingly incomprehensible and insurmountable force, which has a wonderful analog, or wonderful, terrible analog, in the way we feel about life itself.
Yeah, and they're super villains.
Yeah.
Like, they're so villainous.
Yes, yes, which makes it safer to hate them, safer to give yourself over to the feeling. Because if it was, oh, Dan, when Dan's not doing the podcast, he's robbing banks or he's stealing my money. Oh, no, it's not Dan. It's a guy who may have about as much hair as Dan, but who actually has a costume and a throne, and he lives and he's beyond time, so.
Yeah, it's funny to watch the way people, like, they try to humanize. And again, I think it's some advances in storytelling. I think as our culture gets more and more used to that pattern, then you have to vary the pattern a little bit. So they try to give what you're talking about earlier, with some texture to the villain. So even Thanos, like, he wasn't just a homicidal maniac. He had a theory of conservation about life, which I have no idea where that came from, why he has it, but he has it. Essentially he's an ecological villain. Like, he's like, we need to, we have too many people, so I'm going to get rid of half the universe. That's just what I'm going to do. And like, okay, well, that's a little bit of, sounds like almost a good thing, but then everybody has to die right in front of you. And we get to see poor Peter Parker, the teenager, whine to Tony Stark, Mr. Stark, help me. I'm like, okay.
I was surprised. I remember when that happened, watching that picture and going, wait a minute, they've just taken the popular elite position and attached this to the villain. Who signed off on this exactly? I was shocked that he would be an eco-terrorist in the end.
Well, I think it's a nice little variation of the storytelling, in that
worked real well. I was just surprised. I mean, you would make him, you would name him Rich Raronal is what you would name him instead of Thanos, and then you'd have him, sealing up coal mines in concrete or something while people were in it. I mean, that's
sure. Well, I think it's, like I said, trying to get an evolution in the hero where it's got a new wrinkle. It's a new type of villainy. It's a new theory that the villain has. You go back to The Incredibles. I always thought was an interesting version of this. So essentially, this kid got defanned by Mr. Incredible, right, in the original movie. And he got ignored and he got dissed and, treated like a nerd. And so that was enough to turn him into a supervillain wanting to destroy the planet and, kill off all the Incredibles. And so, I think of that and I'm like, that's a fairly thin motivation.
There's today's understatement by Dan French.
But that's kind of the gloriousness of superheroes and those kind of super stories, is that lots of times the villain doesn't have a motivation at all.
Yeah.
They're just crazy.
Yeah.
They want to kill everything. Oh, well, okay. They want to take over the world. I'm like, what are you going to do with it then? But I thought Thanos was an interesting intrusion of some of the cultural wars into that villain, and the idea that he had an ecological perversion of an ecological principle was kind of interesting. Was
it a perversion? I mean, aside from the moral stance of killing a bunch of people, this is just the natural. This is a more enthusiastic exercise in a broader solution, which is too many people. I mean, it seems like he got to the point to me.
Well, I mean, I think typically the moral stance of, hey, we've got too many people in the world, is that an immoral idea? Like, that's a moral idea, right? We're overburdening the planet with too many people.
Right. And so his solution was, I'm just kind of picking at this, I'm just pulling the thread. If the answer is the planet is dying because there are too many people, well, one answer is, well, let's introduce them more slowly or let's get rid of the thing that's killing us. And Thanos is like, what they're going back to Breaking Bad, no half measures.
Yeah, fast solution, man.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting problem. If I may ask you, I'm curious what you think. Do you think that this superhero stuff has a shelf life? When does this stop?
Oh, I think they've been trying to tell these stories forever because they're so popular. I mean, they're mythic, right? It's
Yeah.
our
Oh, yeah.
version of super mythology. And it wasn't until CGI got really good that they were worth watching on the screen. I mean, old
Yeah.
Christopher Reeve superhero stuff is unwatchable.
Sure.
But this stuff, it's like, oh my God. Even the fact, like, I watched Wanda Vision. Did
Oh,
you
I
watch
loved
that?
that. Loved that.
And again, it's now got some psychological texture to it.
Mhm.
She's grieving. I mean, how often do you see a superhero story about a woman grieving the death of her soulmate? And
Yeah.
man, they just stayed in there with you, and you got to see her suffer over and over again. So she was the villain,
Mhm.
until they replaced her with a super villain behind the scenes.
Right.
But Wanda still, she was a witch. And I think you started to see in later superhero comics, they complicated their heroes with some real villainy. Black Widow's another example. Suddenly she's a hero, and she was Catwoman, same thing. Like, they've rescued all these kind of hot villains, and like, people really like having them around. So let's see if we can turn them into heroes.
Yeah.
But WandaVision was great for
Oh, I
that,
loved
man.
it.
It just,
Loved it. And it was so they did not fear playing with any trope at all. They knew what was expected, and they said, well, then we'll go the other direction. And that's, we haven't even touched on the appropriation of all these sitcom styles. In particular, like there was a Malcolm in the Middle episode, basically.
yeah, the aesthetics were just super interesting to watch.
So good. It's a master class in learning how the elements of sitcom, I'm going to say production, but you can probably address it more precisely. The visual elements of a sitcom define how you feel about it. And there was a lot to learn from WandaVision.
Yeah, it was fun watching that and I think, again, I think our culture is getting to the point where we like to watch our storytellers play with that stuff.
Mhm.
Playwrights theater got there years ago, Waiting for Godot, which is a non-story,
Mhm.
The Iceman Cometh, all these things that theater and playwrights have been playing with the meta storytelling for a long time, but we haven't gotten that much of it, especially in our pop culture films. And so I think they're starting to see some of that even within these big mythic, got to appeal to everybody genres. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, how most people took Wanda. I know, like, probably the intelligentsia and people with higher aesthetics about sitcoms and storytelling probably really enjoyed it. I wonder if it confused people who are just like, what? Why do they keep, and like, instead of enjoying that confusion because you're in the hands of a storyteller, the confusion itself pushes people out. I just wonder sometimes, but
Yeah. I think a lot of things work on two levels. I don't think they have to, because I don't think every piece of art has to be made for every person.
no, but
But
it's there as an option if you want to tell a story that way.
right. I'm not sure how entertaining. It's like, for instance, I don't keep up with the Marvel universe. So there was a lot in WandaVision that was lost on me. I'd seen everything up to like the end game picture, and I think that was it. And so there was a lot in there that was lost on me. But I don't know how entertaining it would have been if you didn't know what they were saluting. It might have just seemed weird. In fact, I'm confident it would not have been anything other than, well, why are you in black and white now? Why do I see these strings? What are you
I
doing?
mean, again, going back to theater, it's like watching, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, which is a wonderful film, Tim Roth. And, but the play itself was written because there's so much in Shakespeare that you can explore the side stuff and get plenty of story.
Yeah.
And Stopper wrote it, so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on and weird absurdity, but it's a pleasure of watching somebody work with the side gristle of a story. But when you go outside of that stuff and you're like, okay, well, you still need the narrativity that's going to make this work, like a villain. And I think Wanda in some ways it underperformed on its villainy. I think, like, the white guy CIA rogue who has a
Yeah.
ulterior plan. I'm like, I've seen that a million times. That's lazy villainy. The other witch coming up was kind of, unseen. I didn't really see that coming right away, so I was okay with that. But you knew she wasn't going to be as strong as the Red Witch.
Right.
So,
the catharsis. You were there for the catharsis.
You got some catharsis.
Come for the parody, stay for the catharsis.
You got a little, but then, poor Wanda, she's still grieving at the end, just like, oh shit, I went through all that and it didn't really help me.
Yeah. It was like a side trip.
So what else, when you think of like villains that are coming at you, let's go out of fiction for just a minute, like in the real world, because we both worked in political stuff, like who are the villains that are coming out right now? Because it's so strong in politics. The right and the left has such strong villains. And I'm watching like yesterday, General Miley or whatever going up against, what's his face, Gatz from Florida, and just watching like the back and forth visually a little bit when they're showing the clip. I'm like, here's this guy in full general regalia saying, hey man, I want to understand why white anger attacked my capital, and Gates being like, how dare you?
Yeah.
Well, so which one of those are the villain? Like,
well, I think we were talking about Hicks last time we talked. You remember Bill? I'm going to call him Bill now that he's dead and he can't bitch slap me. As Bill said, I believe the puppet on the left. I believe the puppet on the right. Hey, wait a minute! They got both hands from the same guy up there. And I think if you watch the news and you think of it in terms of what we've been talking about, from the perspective of the person who's picking the shots and who's deciding what to cover, they're choosing to cover it not because they have great moral compunction about some problem they want to save the world. What they'll fucking do is get people to tune in and watch television. And if you know your audience thinks that everybody on the right is evil, then you portray everybody on the right as evil. You don't even make any pretense about it. And if you think everybody on the left is evil, you present them that way. And there were lots of ways to present the Matt Gaetz, General, whoever it was, story, where it was two guys who had profoundly different views of what was going on for their own purposes. But that's not how it was presented on the news. It was presented as villain A versus villain B, or villain versus hero. It was not there to inform you of a motherfucking thing. It was there to work you up, and that's it. And that's all I have to say about it. Is there a good answer? I'm sure there's an answer, but it's not going to be found by putting people on the news every night to bicker at one another and create cheerleading.
Well, yeah, I tell people all the time, the media is not here to judge truth. It's here to, again, create stimulation.
It's there to sell advertising.
Quit finding more purpose in your media than that. It's, but when you look at this, so like I see a lot of people do this with kind of reducing themselves out of that world and trying to find a standpoint that makes sense to them of these false equivalencies, right? So Gates and this, I need to look up his name. We're going to say Miley.
Yeah, let's go with that. General Cyrus, we'll call
General Cyrus.
Miley Cyrus.
Who is more of a villain in those two? Like, who's the villain? Like in your world, when you look at those, not false equivalency, because you can't just say those guys are so different. Miley actually got appointed by Trump and survived the Trump regime and went on into the Biden regime. And Gates, clearly is in the world of the Trump. So like, who is more villainable? Like, can you villainize a guy like Miley, who's had this, military history, and he's clearly done all this stuff, and he's trying to intellectualize, like, can you turn that guy into a villain? Because I'm watching the right try to do it.
Yeah, I can villainize anybody because I'm a writer. That's what I do. You can too. You're a better writer than I am, Dan. You give me anybody. You remember the old
can't make you a villain? Come on, you're blameless.
You remember the old Kinnison thing where he was talking about the story about in the funeral home, and then somebody said, you can't make a joke out of this, and Sam said, give the story to me. And I don't know much about Matt Gaetz. I know that he is a figurehead of that he is portrayed as a crazy man, and he may very well be. I don't know much about him. And this general, I hadn't heard his name until yesterday, but I can tell you, if we set aside a few crazies, most of the people in Washington, D.C. who work in any government the majority of them may not be very good at it, but they want the best for people. And they don't really want to hurt anybody. The result is people get hurt because they have to have compromises. You know, and Matt Gaetz may be a son of a bitch. I don't know. Miley may be a lying sack of shit for all I know. I don't know. But I know that in the main, the people who are making policies are asking, what is the thing that helps the most people? And so to demand that we force them into this villain hero role, which is what the press does, because it serves their purposes. And I don't think the press is bad, but they're like, well, this is what people want to watch. So this is what
storytellers do.
I'd like to eat fucking sugar all day, but it's not good for me. So
neutral people are not interesting.
Thank you. There you go. That's why I can't get worked up about politics. There are moral, cultural, economic questions that affect life and death there, but it's impossible in this environment to talk about them in any way other than fuck you. And so I that's why I don't go there.
Well, and I think this is kind of, I've talked about this a lot with Trump about the imposing of entertainment principles, theatricality and narrativity and things like that into politics. Mm-hmm. Politics inherently is supposed to be boring. It's supposed to be, wonky. It's supposed to be, like you're saying, we have complicated things here. We need to talk about them and make some decisions. And for a long time, Americans completely disassociated from politics because even in its, theatricality, it was so old school and so boring, they couldn't pay attention to it in the context of the training of this super storyism that we've all learned. We have super storytellers.
Yes.
Telling us the most amazing stories all the time. Even going back to plays, like, oh my God, if you just go back and go through the history of theater in America, you can rewatch that stuff from like the 1900s, the 1800s, and be like, this stuff is great. Because there's been smart, feeling, good aesthetics in all of it. Yeah. And so we've got all this training about great storyism. And to me, like, Trump came in and it's like, you know what? I'm just going to import my reality show techniques and just break your boring bullshit. And he did it. Mm-hmm. And immediately, so now everybody's scrambling up back into narrativity. Hero, victims, villains. Those three are going to rocket through all of politics now. And so the first thing that you need that people are going to do is like, well, who's the villain here? That's the first thing you've got to ascertain.
Right.
If you can stain somebody as the villain, then man, you get so much value out of that with the culture. It's pretty amazing.
I'm gonna pull it back. We can go back to let's go back as far as I know how far to go back, which is the radio. And you talk about theatricality. Now you don't have to get on the back of a train. Here you got FDR on the radio every week talking on the radio. Tell me that's not theatricality. Tell me that's not manipulation.
Well, I'm not saying it's manipulation. It's theatricality.
Right. And I'm not saying it was a terrible bad thing, but it's been supercharged over time. But this notion that we can separate, and not that you're offering it, but I think there's no bright line between content and presentation. And they've always been wrapped up tight. And I want to say this other thing too, which I think is important. It doesn't get said enough, and I'll say it anywhere, is this worship of democracy it represents an utter ignorance of how America is set up. America is not a democracy, and that's a good thing. You know what a democracy is? Is three people getting together and taking a vote, and two of them deciding to beat the shit out of the third one. That's majority rule.
And that's a little simple.
But it's also democracy. Democracy is people making choices. Majority does rule within certain principles that we don't change at the drop of a hat. And that's why I think a democratic republic, which is what this is a better thing. This praise about majority. Ultimately, the majority does rule. That's true. But to offer up democracy as the be all end all of everything is a recipe for mob. It's nothing but a fancy word for mob rule.
Look what you just did. This is great. I love it.
Am I a villain now?
Democracy. How dare you villainize democracy? You created a villain.
You are the rhetoric warrior, sir. You are.
How dare you? Democracy is God. It's going to save us. It is the thing, man.
But you see what I just did is I'm being theatrical myself. I'm taking this thing that everybody thinks is is the Jesus of politics, which is democracy, and saying you got the wrong thing up on the pedestal. So anyway, it's something to talk about.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying is like the concept, the practice of creating villains is ultimately the rhetorical principle. So
Yes.
when you look at, and we could break this down, like again, I told you when I suggested this, I could talk about this literally for weeks. Like if you go in and you start piecing it out, like how do you create a villain? So you just took something that doesn't get attacked very often, democracy. It's one of our God words.
Mm-hmm.
And you simplified it with a story of three people, one gets beat shit out of, which is, that's what you do. You create, like, you put a narrative in there that compromises that total good. So people are now like 96% positive about democracy instead of 100%.
But I want to jump off
a technique.
Let's ask our gay friends what they think about democracy up until about the last 20 years. Let's ask them what they thought about democracy. It didn't work very well for them. So yes, and because I think that's an important point. You can say that three people getting together and two beating up one of them is an extreme example, but it's not. It's not. It's just an easy to understand example. Gay people couldn't get married. Gay people couldn't get a job. Gay people could get the shit beat out of them and nobody would look and think twice.
Right. But if I'm playing rhetorician with you, then I just do the same technique back to you. I'm like, democracy is three people getting together and two make a decision that if it ends up compromising the third person in some way, the third person comes back up around and tries to get influence and eventually fixes it. There are ways of like taking majority rule and demonizing it. There are ways of putting it in the middle, which is that mixiness. It's got good and bad things to it.
Yes, yes.
And then there's ways of like completely valorizing, giving a halo and like,
yes.
Hey, that third person doesn't deserve democracy
right.
anyway.
And I agree with everything you said. And I think what I said is what you said, which is there are ways in the middle. And I think that way in the middle is I'm going to use this with a small r because I know a lot of people who listen to this are one side or the other, a Republican approach, not a Mitch McConnell Republican approach, but it is a republic. A republic is not a democracy. And ultimately we have to rely on democracy because we can't come up with some mob thing that's reasonably good. We're just at the mercy of fists and guns. But if we can agree
if that's what mobs, if that's what mobs become,
if we can agree on certain principles that unite us, then indeed within that a democratic rule is the best rule.
But and then this is again why it's so much fun to me to do rhetoric and story and all these things. Like, so the Republic, which is the Senate, essentially as like the stopgap to the mob rule of democracy, becomes your good. That becomes your hero. Versus right now, which is what is happening, is that's becoming the evil. Like that is the villain that's stopping us from doing progressive politics and doing some innovation. And it's corrupted to the point where they can import, things and they can block things that shouldn't be blocked. So you've seen this battle now. Again, it's a hero-villain battle. And it's fascinating rhetorically to just watch people work on it in that context. And to me, like a rhetorician and a storyteller and all this, the value of it is you can step back and go, hey, it's just a story fight at this point. Let me do everything I can to heroize my side and villainize your side, and I'm going to win. Yeah, that's the real battle.
And that's the real battle. I mean, just the way you presented it right there, which is the mainstream presentation, which is the good people want to do all these innovative things and the bad Senate wishes to stop it. There's a plurality of people who say a bunch of bad people want to do things and the Senate's the only heroic force to stop them from tearing it down. And then we end up, you and I are pretty good at just talking in story, but the rest of the world, if they're not aware of the stories that are manipulating them, are at the mercy of their own feelings sometimes. And here we are.
That's exactly why the whole thing about rhetoric warriors is to pull people back into process.
Yes.
I tell people endlessly, I do not know if the Senate is evil or if it's the greatest thing we've had around forever and ever and ever. That is not my thing. What I do know is that I can show you how to process those options like if you want to use rationality and logic, great. If you want to use story, great. Doesn't matter. but that's my expertise, is to keep you in process. And
Yeah.
so you don't get locked into your groove, which is telling you, God damn McConnell, he looks like a turtle.
Pretty good at it, Dan.
He's evil.
You're pretty good at it, Dan. You're pretty good at it.
It's fascinating. Well, this has been super fun, man. Like I knew it would be. I think maybe next time we come back around and talk about heroes, and then we talk about victims. We should have a little 3-part thing here.
We'll just get it. We'll each get a bottle of scotch, and we'll see how long it takes to empty it, and that'll be the whole thing. Just what do you think?
This is education. Like lectures, great. I'm so tired of lecturing to people. I've been doing it my whole life. I like having really interesting conversations and let people overhear. You know, they can poach in and find what they like, and this is what I enjoy. So, but promote your class, man. Tell people to go to your class. I'll put this.
Sure. I'll just give out my email. Email me at mike@mikelongonline.com. That's mike@mikelongonline.com. Send you information about my speechwriting course I'm teaching through the Professional Speechwriters Association, September 14th through the 17th. It's just a couple of hours a day. And if you've never written a speech before, but you're curious about it, here's a way for you to learn it. If you're already doing this kind of work a little bit, I'll reinforce what you know and give you some new tricks. And it'll be a lot of fun. It'll be less swearing than there has been today, although not much less. So
not a lot of swearing. Do we swear a lot? I don't think
vulgarity, I guess. I got no
vulgarity,
but I try to. It is. It's a villain. Shoot me an email or just visit mikelongonline.com and we'll talk. And
if you're trying to remember his name, remember Longshanks, one of the great villains from Braveheart.
Oh, that helps. Yeah, that's bouncing around in everybody's head.
Longshanks. That'll make you a villain. Like you
Michael
killed William Wallace. You killed Mel Gibson when he was still good.
You must not have seen him in that Santa Claus movie a couple of months ago.
That guy went from hero to villain really fast.
Oh man, gosh.
It's amazing. A 40-year career, one bad drunk night with a cop camcorder, and you're completely changed him from hero to villain. Fascinating.
How about a little grace? There's what the world needs. A little grace.
Well, man, super fun again. We will circle back around. Everybody go to Mike Long's class. Check it out. He's got lots of good stuff to say. You'll get a lot out of it. Appreciate it, Mike. This has been the Rhetoric Warriors podcast. Get out there, persuade people. You'll enjoy it. They'll be better for it.